The Senate chamber in Washington, D.C., was a cauldron of tension on the morning of May 31, 2025. As the clock struck 9 a.m., signaling the start of a pivotal session on education reform. The room, a grand expanse of polished marble floors and towering mahogany panels, seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and the faint rustle of papers. Senators sat at their desks, their aides darting between them with whispered updates, while a small army of reporters lined the back wall, their cameras trained on the scene for a live C-SPAN broadcast that would beam every word to the nation. The gallery above was packed with onlookers, lobbyists, educators, and activists who had traveled from across the country to witness the debate over a bill that promised to reshape how federal dollars flowed to America's schools. At the center of the storm was a proposal to redirect billions in funding toward urban districts. A plan that had already ignited fierce arguments on cable news and X, where hashtags like #EducationEquity and #Rural Schools Matter had been trending for weeks. The bill's champion, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, stood at her podium, a formidable figure in a tailored navy blazer, her red-framed glasses catching the light as she surveyed the room with the intensity of a general preparing for battle. Her desk was a fortress of preparation. Stacks of reports, highlighted in neon yellow, sat beside a laptop displaying spreadsheets of funding disparities. Warren, a former Harvard law professor and a progressive icon, had built her career on dismantling systemic inequities. And today she was determined to see her vision through. Her voice, clear and commanding, sliced through the murmurs as she began her opening statement, her hands gesturing with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. "This bill is about justice," she declared, her tone unwavering. "It's about closing the gaps that leave children in cities like Boston, where I've walked the streets of Roxbury and Dorchester, talking to parents and teachers without the resources they need to thrive. The data doesn't lie. Urban schools face a funding shortfall of $1,500 per student compared to suburban districts. In Massachusetts, we've seen how investments in education can transform lives, from the tech hubs of Cambridge to the classrooms of Springfield. But we can't stop there. We must act. And we must act now." Behind her, a screen lit up with charts, each bar graph a stark illustration of the disparities she described. Each statistic, a call to action. Her words were a masterclass in policy advocacy, rooted in the kind of rigorous analysis that had earned her a reputation as one of the Senate's most formidable debaters. Across the chamber, Senator John Neely Kennedy of Louisiana sat with a deceptively casual air, his chair tilted back just enough to suggest he was more at ease than the moment warranted. His suit, a shade of gray that looked like it had been worn through a Louisiana summer, was slightly rumpled, and his muted plaid seemed chosen more for comfort than style. But his eyes, sharp and glinting behind wire-rimmed glasses, betrayed a mind that missed nothing. Kennedy, who lived in the small town of Madisonville along the Chifuncte River with his wife, Becky, and their dogs, had a reputation for disarming charm, a southern drawl that could lull opponents into underestimating him, and a knack for turning complex issues into folksy parables that resonated with his constituents. He'd spent the morning sipping black coffee from a thermos, his legal pad filled with doodles of fishing boats and scribbled notes about the bill's impact on rural schools. As Warren spoke, her voice echoing with the weight of academic authority, Kennedy listened, his pen tapping a slow rhythm against the desk. He respected her intellect. Nobody rose to her level without being brilliant, but he found her reliance on numbers and studies detached, a far cry from the lived experiences of the people he represented in places like St. Tammany Parish, where schools struggled with crumbling infrastructure and outdated textbooks. When his turn came, he stood slowly, adjusting his glasses with a deliberate motion, and offered a smile that was equal parts warmth and mischief. "Well, now," he began, his voice a slow, syrupy drawl that seemed to transport the chamber to a Louisiana porch at dusk. "I appreciate Senator Warren's passion for her city folks, and I reckon those charts of hers are mighty impressive. But let me tell y'all a little story about a fella I know back in Madisonville. Amos Boudreau, a farmer who's been working the same patch of land since before I was born, never went to college, but he could fix a tractor with his eyes closed and tell you the exact day the rains would come just by sniffing the air. Amos taught me something. Fairness ain't just about numbers on a page. It's about people. This bill, as I see it, pours money into places like Boston while leaving schools in towns like Zachary and Covington to make do with less. In Louisiana, we've got kids learning science with textbooks from the 90s, and teachers driving an hour to the nearest Walmart to buy supplies out of their own pockets. That ain't right. The chamber stirred, a few senators chuckling at the image of Amos, others nodding as Kennedy's words hit home. His argument was simple but effective. The bill, in its current form, favored urban centers at the expense of rural communities. And he wasn't about to let that slide. Warren listened, her expression a mask of professionalism, but inside, she was seething. She admired Kennedy's ability to connect with an audiences. He'd seen his viral clips on X, where his quips about Washington bureaucrats racked up thousands of likes, but she found his approach maddening. To her, policy was a science, built on evidence and analysis, not anecdotes about farmers and tractors. She'd spent years studying education disparities, from her days teaching at Harvard to her time on the campaign trail in Massachusetts, where she'd met families in Lowell and Lawrence who depended on schools to break the cycle of poverty. Kennedy's stories, while charming, felt like a distraction, a way to dodge the hard truths of data, as he concluded, suggesting the bill needed a hefty dose of common sense. Warren rose, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Senator Kennedy," she said, her tone icy but controlled, "with all due respect, policy isn't a country fable spun over a glass of sweet tea on a porch in Madisonville. It requires precision, rigor, and a commitment to evidence. I'm not sure your stories, however charming, meet that standard." The words landed like a thunderclap, a not-so-subtle jab at Kennedy's intellect, and the chamber fell silent. A few senators exchanged glances, sensing a line had been crossed, while the C-SPAN cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment for posterity. Warren sat, her posture rigid, satisfied she'd made her point. But Kennedy's smile didn't waver. He leaned into his microphone, his drawl slower now, each word deliberate. "Ma'am," he said, pausing for effect, "I learned more about fairness in Amos's barn than you did in all your years at Harvard. You can stack your charts to the moon, but if they don't help kids in places like St. Tammany Parish, they're just pretty pictures." The chamber erupted not in applause, but in a collective gasp, followed by murmurs of approval from some and indignation from others. Kennedy sat back, his expression serene, as if he'd just tossed a pebble into a pond and was waiting for the ripples to spread. The exchange was a lightning strike, a clash of two Americas. Warren's Massachusetts, with its progressive ideals, world-class universities like MIT and Harvard, and tech-driven economy, against Kennedy's Louisiana, a land of Cajun culture, sprawling bayous, and small towns where community trumped credentials. Within minutes, the moment was clipped and uploaded to X, where it spread like wildfire. Hashtags like #BarnSmarts and #Warren vs. Kennedy began trending, with users from Boston praising Warren's intellectual rigor and Louisianans hailing Kennedy as a defender of the common man. In Cambridge, students at a coffee shop near Harvard Square debated whether Warren's comment was a justified critique or an elitist misstep, their voices rising over the clink of espresso cups. In Madisonville, folks gathered at a diner on the riverfront toasted Kennedy with glasses of sweet tea laughing about how he'd put that Harvard lady in her place. The bill itself faded into the background as the personal became political, each senator embodying a broader cultural divide. Warren retreated to her D.C. office that evening, the city's lights glittering outside her window, and pored over amendments to strengthen her case, determined to prove her point with even more data. She thought of the families she'd met in Boston's South End, the teachers who'd told her about overcrowded classrooms, and the students who deserved better. Kennedy, meanwhile, called Becky from his hotel room, the hum of cicadas audible through the phone as she sat on their porch in Madisonville. "I reckon we stirred the pot today," he said, chuckling, already planning his next move. He knew the viral moment had given him leverage, not just in the Senate but in the court of public opinion, where his brand of wisdom forged in the fields and backroads of Louisiana resonated more than Warren's spreadsheets ever could. As the day ended, the stage was set for a larger reckoning, one that would test both senators' convictions and reveal the fault lines of a nation divided, from the bustling streets of Boston to the quiet rivers of Madisonville. The morning after the Senate showdown, the sun rose over Boston, Massachusetts, casting a golden glow on the Charles River and the glass towers of the city's tech corridor, but the warmth did little to thaw the icy divide that had erupted online and in the streets. The viral clip of Senator Elizabeth Warren's sharp jab at Senator John Neely Kennedy and his biting, folksy rhetoric had exploded across X, racking up millions of views in less than 12 hours. In Cambridge, just across the river from Boston, the air buzzed with debate as students and professors gathered in the cozy confines of a coffee shop near Harvard Square, a favorite haunt for the academic crowd Warren had long called her own. The shop, with its exposed brick walls and chalkboard menu, was abuzz with the clink of espresso cups and the hum of laptops as a group of graduate students from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government dissected the exchange over steaming lattes. "She was right to call him out," said Priya, a policy student in a crimson hoodie, her fingers tapping on her tablet as she pulled up Warren's charts from the hearing. "Kennedy's stories are a distraction. We need data to fix education, not some farmer's parable. Massachusetts has led the way on this. Look at our schools in Somerville and Lowell, where tech grants have boosted STEM programs." Her friend Marcus, a political science major, nodded but pushed back, his voice low over the hiss of the espresso machine. "Sure," but her tone, calling him out like that, made her sound elitist. People on X are tearing her apart for it. She's playing into the coastal elite stereotype, and that's dangerous for a progressive in a purple country. Outside, the streets of Cambridge were alive with spring energy bicyclists weaving through traffic, street musicians strumming guitars near the T station, but the mood was charged with a sense of defensiveness. Warren's supporters, many of whom had voted for her progressive vision of equity, rallied around her. The Boston Globe ran an editorial praising her uncompromising commitment to evidence-based policy, while a group of MIT students launched a hashtag numbered data-driven to counter the wave of memes mocking Warren as a Harvard snob. At a local bookstore in Brookline, a community organizer named Elena hosted a panel discussion on education reform where attendees, mostly teachers and parents from Boston's diverse neighborhood, shared Warren's focus on urban schools. "She gets it," Elena said, her voice echoing through the small crowd. "In Roxbury, our kids need resources, not stories. Warren's fighting for us." But even among her allies, there was a nagging worry. Her comment, however justified, had handed Kennedy a narrative victory, one that could haunt her in the court of public opinion. Halfway across the country, the mood in Louisiana was a stark contrast, as vibrant and unapologetic as the state's Cajun culture. In Madisonville, where Senator Kennedy lived in a modest two-story home along the Chafuncta River, the morning unfolded with the slow rhythm of a southern spring. The river sparkled under the sun, its banks lined with cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, while the town's residents gathered at a riverside park for a community crawfish boil, a tradition that brought folks together over steaming pots of spicy seafood and Zydeco music. blaring from a portable speaker. The air smelled of cayenne and lemon, and laughter filled the space as children ran barefoot through the grass, their parents sipping a beer and swapping stories about the senator who'd given that Boston lady what for. At a folding table, piled high with corn and potatoes, a group of locals, farmers, mechanics, and school teachers passed around a phone, replaying Kennedy's retort for the dozenth time. "I learned more about fairness in Amos's barn than you did at Harvard," he'd said. And the line had already become a local legend. "That's our boy," said Tommy, a grizzled farmer in a straw hat, his hands stained with engine grease. "Kennedy don't mess around. He knows what it's like out here. Schools in St. Tammany Parish are falling apart. And she's over there talking about charts? We need someone who gets us." His wife, Marla, a third-grade teacher, nodded, her eyes fierce. "My classroom's got a leaky roof and 20-year-old textbooks. I don't care about Boston's problems. Kennedy's fighting for our kids." The crawfish boil turned into a rally of sorts, with folks hoisting signs that read, "Barn Smarts beat Book Smarts," and snapping photos to post on X under the hashtag #BarnSmarts, which was gaining traction faster than the MIT students' counter-campaign. In nearby Baton Rouge, a local radio host dedicated his morning show to Kennedy, playing Zydeco tunes between caller rants about northern elitists who didn't understand the South. "Senator Kennedy's one of us," the host declared, his voice crackling through car radios across the state. "He's got the guts to stand up to folks like Warren, who think a Harvard degree makes them better than us." The sentiment wasn't universal. In New Orleans, a more progressive pocket of the state, grumbled that Kennedy's folksy act was a calculated performance, but in rural towns like Madisonville and Zachary, he was a hero, a David who'd slung a verbal stone at the Goliath of East Coast academia. Back in Massachusetts, Warren spent the day in her Boston office, a sleek space overlooking the harbor, where sailboats bobbed against the skyline. She sat at her desk, surrounded by policy briefs and a whiteboard covered in bullet points about the education bill, but her mind was elsewhere. The X-storm had rattled her not because she doubted her argument, but because she knew perception mattered as much as policy in a polarized nation. Her staff, a team of young aides in button-downs and sensible shoes, buzzed around her, pulling up analytics on the hashtag trends and drafting statements to counter the narrative. "We need to pivot," said her communications director, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah, as she scrolled through X on her laptop. "They're painting you as out of touch. We should do a press conference maybe in Dorchester. With local parents, though, show you're fighting for real people, not just data." Warren nodded, her jaw tight. But she felt a flicker of frustration. She'd spent her career fighting for the underdog, from her days as a consumer advocate to her Senate campaigns, where she'd walked the streets of Fall River and Lawrence, listening to families struggling to get by. The idea that she was out of touch stung, but she knew Sarah was right. By late afternoon, she stood at a podium in a Dorchester community center, the walls adorned with children's artwork, and spoke to a small crowd of parents and teachers. "I'm not here to play games," she said, her voice steady but softer than in the Senate chamber. "I'm here because I've seen what happens when we invest in our schools right here in Boston, where kids in underserved neighborhoods deserve better. My comment yesterday wasn't about dismissing anyone's experience. It was about demanding we base policy on facts, not stories." The crowd applauded, but the press conference didn't make the splash her team had hoped. On X, the #BarnSmarts hashtag continued to dominate, fueled by Kennedy's supporters, who saw Warren's words as a backhanded apology at best. In Louisiana, Kennedy was playing a different game, one he'd mastered over years of retail politics in a state where personal connection trumped policy papers. That evening, he attended a festival in Zachary, a small town north of Baton Rouge, where the annual Crawfish Festival was in full swing. The fairgrounds were a riot of colored and white tents, strings of lights twinkling in the dusk, and the smell of boiled crawfish mingling with the sweetness of beignets frying in a nearby stall. Kennedy, dressed in a plaid shirt and jeans, worked the crowd like a seasoned performer, shaking hands, posing for selfies, and cracking jokes about those fancy folks in Boston who think gumbo comes from a can. The crowd roared with laughter, their affection for him palpable, but his comments weren't just for laughs, they were calculated to keep the narrative alive. At one point, he climbed onto a makeshift stage, a microphone in hand, and addressed the crowd, his drawl carrying over the hum of the festival. "Y'all saw what happened in D.C., he said, grinning. "I reckon Senator Warren's got a lot of book smarts. But down here, we know a thing or two about life. We don't need charts to tell us our schools are hurting, we see it every day. And I'll be darned if I let Washington forget about us." The crowd cheered, waving signs with slogans like, "Kennedy for the win." And the moment was captured on countless phones, uploaded to X with captions that spread his message further. Behind the scenes, Kennedy's team was already planning his next move. A national television appearance where he'd face Warren head-on. A debate that promised to amplify their clash to an even bigger audience. As the day drew to a close, the divide between Massachusetts and Louisiana felt wider than ever. A microcosm of a nation, split along cultural and political fault lines. In Boston, Warren's supporters doubled down, organizing rallies and writing op-eds to defend her vision. While in Madisonville, Kennedy's constituents turned their crawfish boils into celebrations of Southern pride. On X, the hashtags number data-driven and number bond-smarts battled for supremacy, each side digging in, refusing to yield. But beneath the noise, both senators knew the stakes were higher than a viral moment. The education bill, with its promise to reshape millions of lives, hung in the balance, and their next confrontation live television debate, scheduled for the following week, would determine not just the bill's fate, but the narrative of who spoke for America's future. Warren spent her evening in her office, the lights of Boston Harbor reflecting in her window, her mind racing with strategies to win back the public. Kennedy, meanwhile, sat on a folding chair at the festival, a plate of crawfish on his lap, watching the stars come out over the fairgrounds, a quiet smile on his face as he planned his next move in a game he knew he could play better than most. The bright lights of a Manhattan television studio cast a stark glow over the set of America Unfiltered, a primetime debate show renowned for its no-holds-barred political showdowns. As the live broadcast began on a warm evening, the studio, a modern space with a minimalist aesthetic black leather chairs arranged around a sleek glass table, a massive LED screen, displaying the show's logos filled with the low hum of a 300-person audience, their anticipation palpable as they shifted in their seats. Outside, the streets of Midtown Manhattan buzzed with the usual urban symphony, the blare of taxi horns, the chatter of tourists snapping photos in Times Square, and the sizzle of street vendor hot dogs on grills. The city's energy, a stark contrast to the focused tension inside. The viral Senate exchange between Senators Elizabeth Warren and John Neely Kennedy, followed by the social media storm that had dominated X for days, had turned their rivalry into a national spectacle, a clash of ideals that pitted data-driven progressivism against folksy pragmatism. The moderator, Rachel Carter, a seasoned journalist with a reputation for cutting through political spin, stood at the center of the set, her navy suit impeccable, her expression calm, but her eyes alight with the gravity of the moment. "Good evening, America," she began, her voice carrying over the audience's enthusiastic applause. "Tonight, we're joined by Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts and Senator John Neely Kennedy of Louisiana to discuss education reform, the urban-rural divide, and the personal feud that's captured the nation's attention. Let's dive in." The audience clapped again, the LED screen flashing the hashtag number America Unfiltered, which was already trending as viewers at home posted reactions on X in real time. Their comments a mix of support, snark, and speculation about who would emerge victorious. Elizabeth Warren sat to Carter's left, her posture ramrod straight, her hands resting on a binder filled with notes she'd prepared over countless late nights in her Boston office. The view of the harbor from her window had offered little comfort in the days leading up to this debate, as the backlash from her Senate comment dismissing Kennedy's folksy anecdotes as insufficient for policy had hit harder than she'd anticipated. It wasn't that she doubted her position. She believed in the power of data to solve systemic problems. A conviction forged through years of fighting for working families in places like Worcester and Springfield, where she'd seen firsthand how underfunded schools trapped kids in cycles of poverty. But the narrative that had taken hold on X, painting her as an out-of-touch elitist, stung deeply. She'd spent her career advocating for the underdog. From her days as a consumer advocate to her Senate campaigns, where she'd walked the streets of Lawrence, listening to parents who dreamed of better futures for their children. Now, as she sat under the studio lights, the weight of that narrative pressed down on her. And she knew this debate was as much about reclaiming her image as it was about the education bill. She adjusted her red-framed glasses, her jaw set with determination, and waited for Carter's first question, her mind racing with the statistics she'd memorized. Urban schools in Massachusetts faced a funding gap of $1,500 per student, a disparity that translated into fewer textbooks, larger class sizes, and crumbling facilities. She was ready to fight not just for the bill, but for the families who depended on it. To Carter's right sat John Neely Kennedy, his posture more relaxed. One leg crossed over the other as he leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. He'd flown in from Louisiana that morning, leaving behind the quiet of his Madisonville home along the Chifuncte River, where he and his wife, Becky, had spent the previous evening on their porch, sipping sweet tea and watching fireflies dance in the dusk. The viral moment from the Senate had turned him into a folk hero among his constituents, who'd rallied around his barn smarts, quipped with crawfish boils and festival cheers, but Kennedy knew better than to rest on his laurels. He'd spent years honing his persona as a down-to-earth Southerner, a small-town lawyer who could outwit the Washington elite, but beneath the plaid shirt and drawl was a strategist who understood the power of perception. The debate offered a chance to cement his image as the voice of rural America, a role he'd embraced since his days as Louisiana's state treasurer. He thought of the schools in St. Blanc, Tammany Parish, where teachers like Marla, whom he'd met at the crawfish boil, struggled with leaky roofs and outdated supplies, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His legal pad, tucked into his briefcase, was filled with notes not statistics, but stories, each one a weapon in his rhetorical arsenal. As Carter introduced him, he nodded to the audience, his smile widening, and the crowd responded with a wave of applause, many of them clearly fans of his Southern charm. Carter wasted no time. Her first question cutting straight to the heart of the feud. Senator Warren, your comment in the Senate about Senator Kennedy's reliance on stories rather than data sparked a firestorm. Do you regret it? And how do you respond to critics who say it reflects an elitist attitude? The audience leaned forward, the silence heavy as Warren took a measured breath. I don't regret standing up for evidence-based policy, she began, her voice firm but warmer than it had been in the Senate chamber. In Massachusetts, I've seen what happens when we invest in our school skids in Boston's South End, where I've met with parents now have access to STEM labs because of data-driven decisions. But I do regret if my words came across as dismissive. I've spent my life fighting for working families, from Fall River to New Bedford. And I know their struggles aren't just numbers, they're real. My point was that we need both, the heart to care and the facts to act. The audience clapped politely, though some on X were already calling her response too rehearsed. Carter turned to Kennedy, her eyebrow raised. Senator Kennedy, your barn smarts retort went viral. but some say it's a dodge to avoid engaging with the data. How do you justify your approach? Kennedy chuckled, his drawl rolling out like molasses. Well, Rachel, I reckon folks in Louisiana don't need a spreadsheet to know their schools are hurting. I've seen it myself, kids in Covington sharing textbooks that fall apart. Teachers in Zachary buying supplies out of their own pockets. I tell stories because that's how we connect. How we understand what's at stake. Senator Warren's got her charts. And that's fine. But I'm here for the folks who don't read policy briefs at the dinner table. The audience erupted in applause, louder this time, and Kennedy's smile widened, though he caught a flicker of frustration in Warren's eyes. The debate moved to the education bill itself, with Carter pressing both senators on their visions for America's schools. Warren leaned into her strengths, citing studies that showed urban schools in cities like Boston and Springfield benefited most from targeted funding, her hands gesturing to emphasize each point. We're talking about equity, she said, her voice rising with passion. In Massachusetts, we've seen how investments in early education can close achievement gaps. Kids in Lawrence are reading at grade level because of programs we funded with federal dollars. This bill extends that model nationwide, ensuring no child is left behind because of their zip code. Her argument was airtight, a blend of passion and precision, and the audience responded with nods of approval, though some on X grumbled that she was lecturing again. Kennedy countered with a different tack, his tone conversational, as if he were chatting over a fence. I don't disagree that cities need help, he said. But this bill's like putting all your bait in one fishing hole. In Louisiana, our rural schools are starving places like Madisonville. Where I live, can't afford new buses, so kids miss class when the old ones break down. We need a balance, not a one-size-fits-all plan from Washington. He paused, then added, I talked to a principal in St. Plains, Tammany Parish last week. Her schools got no heat in winter, but they can't afford repairs. That's what I'm fighting for. The audience clapped again, and Carter noted the divide. Warren's focus on systemic solutions versus Kennedy's emphasis on local realities. As the debate progressed, a shift began to emerge. Subtle at first, but undeniable. Carter asked a question about bridging the urban-rural divide, and Warren's response took a new tone. I've been thinking a lot about this, she said, her voice softer, less guarded. In Boston, we've got resources, but I've heard from folks in rural Massachusetts, places like the Berkshire Shoe feel forgotten, just like Senator Kennedy's constituents. Maybe I've been too focused on the numbers, and not enough on the stories behind them. We need both. The admission caught Kennedy off guard, and the audience murmured in surprise, some on X praising her for showing humility. Kennedy, sensing an opening, leaned in, his drawl gentler now. I appreciate that, Senator, he said. And I'll admit, I've been hard on your charts, but they've got their place. I just want folks in Louisiana to know they're heard. Same as folks in Boston. Maybe we can find a middle ground, more funding for everybody, but with flexibility for places like mine. The audience clapped, louder than before, and for the first time, the two senators shared a nod of mutual respect. A small but significant gesture that didn't go unnoticed. The debate ended with a question from the audience. A teacher from Ohio asked how they'd ensure the bill didn't deepen national divisions. Warren spoke first, her voice steady. We start by listening to each other, to communities, to the data and the stories. I've learned that this week, and I'll do better. Kennedy followed, his tone earnest. We do it by remembering we're all Americans, whether we're in a Boston high-rise or a Louisiana bayou. We fight for our peace, but we don't forget the whole pie. The audience gave a standing ovation, and Carter wrapped the show, the LED screen flashing a poll that showed viewers split 50-50 on who'd won, a testament to the balance they'd struck. Off stage, Warren and Kennedy shook hands, their exchange brief but genuine. We'll get that bill right, Warren said, and Kennedy nodded. Long as we both keep talking. Back in their home states, the debate had a ripple effect. In Cambridge, students at a Harvard lecture hall discussed Warren's growth, inspired by her willingness to evolve. While in Madisonville, folks at a riverside diner praised Kennedy for holding his ground, but finding common ground. On X, the hashtags #DataDriven and #BarnSmarts gave way to #Bridge the Divide, a sign that the nation, though still fractured, was searching for unity. The education bill passed a month later, amended to include provisions for rural schools, a compromise that bore the fingerprints of both senators. Warren returned to Boston with a renewed commitment to listening, while Kennedy, back on his porch in Madisonville, smiled at the thought that sometimes a good story and a good fight could change the game.